My name is Naomi Calloway. I am 34 years old. 9 days ago, I sat in my parked car outside my mother's house with my thumb hovering over a single button on my banking app. The button said cancel AUTOPAY. Underneath it, in smaller gray letters, it said, "This will affect 4 linked accounts. Are you sure?" I was sure. I had been sure for exactly 6 days, 4 hours, and about 40 minutes. Ever since I stood in my mother's hallway with a glass of lukewarm lemonade in my hand and heard my own family laughing about me through a door they thought was closed. I didn't press the button yet. Not in the car. I wanted to press it somewhere specific, at a specific hour, in front of a specific person. I wanted the timing to matter. Because here is what nobody in my family understood about me. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother, not even the version of myself that existed 6 days earlier. I don't do revenge. I do reconciliation of accounts. And when the numbers stop reconciling, I close the book. 3 days from that moment in the car, a mortgage payment was scheduled to leave my account and land in my parents' loan servicer's account, the same way it had landed there for the last 31 months. A brake job on my brother's truck was scheduled to be paid off in full. My mother's Visa balance, the one she called just a little cushion, was due for its minimum payment on the 14th, a payment I had made, without fail, for 2.5 years. All of it ran through me. All of it ran through one account, one signature, one woman they had started calling, when they thought I couldn't hear them, the wallet with a heartbeat. I hadn't decided yet, sitting in that car, exactly how I would end it. I only knew that in 72 hours, at exactly 9 in the morning, on the 14th, everything that had been running quietly for years was going to stop running. And none of them would see it coming until it already had. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the one expected to fix it, fund it, and stay quiet about it, this story is for you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Because what happens at the 14th hour of this story is the part everyone asks me to tell twice. But let me back up. Let me take you to the beginning, back before the hallway, before the lemonade, before I understood exactly what my family had built me into. I am a claims integrity auditor for a regional hospital network. That's a fancy way of saying I spend my days finding the exact place where a number stops matching what it's supposed to be. I read insurance contracts the way other people read novels. I can find a miscoded charge, a duplicated billing line, a clause buried on page 41 that changes the entire meaning of page 4. My coworkers call me relentless. My supervisor calls me the reason the network recovered $2.1 million in misfiled claims last year. My family, for most of my adult life, called me responsible and said it like a compliment and meant it like a leash. I have one habit that has nothing to do with any of that. Every single morning, no matter what, I order a black coffee with a cinnamon stick stirred into it. Never a cinnamon shake, never a syrup. A literal cinnamon stick from the jar by the register at the shop 3 blocks from my condo. I've done it since I was 22. It started as a joke with a college roommate and never stopped being a comfort. If you ever want to know how bad a day has been for me, look at how many times I've reordered that coffee before noon. On the day of the hallway, it was 3. I grew up the second of 2 children in a house in Ashworth Falls, a town small enough that everyone at the grocery store knew whose daughter you were before they knew your name. My brother Tyler is 2 years younger than me. From the time he was in elementary school, our house ran on an unspoken hierarchy, and it never changed. Not once, not even after we were both adults with our own mail delivered to our own addresses. Tyler was the golden one. Not because he was cruel, not because he tried to be, but because our parents had decided, somewhere before either of us could talk, that Tyler was the one who needed protecting and I was the one who could protect. He got the benefit of the doubt. I got the benefit of being useful. There is a phrase my mother has used my entire life, a phrase that got repeated at every holiday, every crisis, every quiet request that wasn't really a request. She'd say it warmly, like it was a value, like it was something out of a greeting card. We take care of our own. That was the family motto, and for years, I believed it meant something mutual. It took me a long time to understand that in our house, we always meant me, and our own always meant everyone else. The first time I remember hearing it with real weight behind it, I was 19, home from my second year of college, and my father's construction business had a bad quarter. I had $1,100 in a savings account from a summer internship. My mother sat across from me at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and said, "Your father's going to need some help this month. We take care of our own, Naomi. That's what family does." I gave her the $1,100. I told myself it was a loan. It was never repaid, and it was never meant to be. The second time, I was 26, 3 years into my first real job, and Tyler had crashed his car into a guardrail outside of Millbrook, uninsured, at fault, with a citation for reckless driving that could have cost him his license. My mother called me at 11 at night. She didn't ask if I could help. She said, "We take care of our own, and your brother needs a lawyer by Monday." I paid for the lawyer. $6,200, wired the next morning before I'd even had coffee. I remember that morning clearly, because it's the first time I noticed how automatic the whole exchange had become. There was no negotiation. There was no moment where anyone asked whether I had $6,000 sitting around, whether it would set back my own savings, whether I had plans for that money at all. I simply moved it, the way you move a stack of files from one folder to another, because the request had been framed, from the very first word, as something that had already been decided. Tyler texted me 2 days later, a single line, "Thanks for handling that," as though I'd fixed a printer jam rather than kept his license and his record intact. I remember sitting with my phone in my hand afterward, waiting for a second text, a fuller one, and it never came. That was the first time a small, quiet part of me noticed the gap between what I gave and what came back. And it was also the first time I told that small, quiet part of me to be reasonable, to remember that he was my little brother, to remember that families help each other, to remember, above all, that we take care of our own. Somewhere between those two moments, there was a stretch of nearly a year where the requests came smaller and more frequent, which in hindsight was its own kind of warning sign, though I didn't read it that way at the time. A car repair for my mother's sedan, $400. A loan for Tyler's security deposit on his first apartment that was never mentioned again, let alone repaid, $1,100. A contribution toward my parents' anniversary trip that my mother framed as a gift from the whole family, even though I was the only one who actually transferred any money, $600. None of these felt significant on their own. Each one was small enough to absorb without noticing, the financial equivalent of a paper cut and paper cuts, as anyone who's ever gotten several in a week knows, don't actually hurt any less for being small. They just take longer to notice you're bleeding. There was a third time, too, one I didn't think about for years because it was smaller, almost forgettable on its own, and it's only in hindsight that I understand how much it taught my family about me. I was 28. My cousin's wedding was that autumn, and my mother had volunteered our family to cover the cost of the rehearsal dinner flowers, a commitment she'd made in a phone call before mentioning it to anyone who might actually be paying for it. When the florist's invoice came in at just under $900, she called me the same night, not to ask if I could help, but to ask which card I wanted the deposit put on, as though the decision that mattered was the payment method, not the payment itself. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my shoulder, already scrolling to my banking app before she'd even finished the sentence. It wasn't a request. It was a logistics question, and I answered it like one. Looking back, that's the moment I'd point to now as the real beginning of the infrastructure. Not because $900 mattered on its own, but because it was the first time my mother made a financial commitment on my behalf, in advance, without asking, and simply expected me to fill in the gap. I didn't notice it as a pattern then. I noticed it as a mild inconvenience, the kind you forgive because you love someone and because $900 in isolation felt like nothing. It's only when you stack 4 or 5 nothings on top of each other over a decade that you realize you've been quietly building someone else's financial floor out of your own ceiling. By the time I was 30, the pattern wasn't a pattern anymore. It was infrastructure. It had become load-bearing. When my father's knees finally forced him into early retirement and the business closed, when the second mortgage they'd taken to keep the business alive stopped being sustainable on my parents' fixed income, nobody had a family meeting about it. My mother simply handed me an envelope on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of envelope that has a lender's logo printed in the corner, and said, "We take care of our own." I set up the auto pay from my checking account 2 days later. I told myself I was being the responsible one. I did not yet understand that responsible and exploited can look, from a certain angle, exactly the same. There's a specific skill claims auditors develop that most people never have to learn, and it's the skill of reading a document for what it actually says instead of what it's supposed to mean. Insurance contracts are full of language designed to sound generous while quietly limiting what it covers, clauses that use words like reasonable and customary that turn out, on closer inspection, to mean whatever the insurer needs them to mean in that particular case. My entire career has been built on refusing to accept the friendly summary and going straight to the actual text every single time. It took me far too long to realize I had never once applied that same discipline to my own family, where "we take care of our own" functioned exactly like one of those vague contract clauses, sounding mutual, meaning one-directional, and never once being tested against what it would actually cost to hold it to its plain meaning. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this can sound from the outside. I wasn't blind. I wasn't naive. I am a woman who audits $500,000 contracts for a living. I knew, on some level, that I was carrying weight that wasn't fairly distributed. But there is a particular kind of quiet math that happens inside a family. A math where love gets converted into obligation, gets converted into automatic payments, and you don't stop to check the exchange rate until something forces you to. For me, that something happened on a Tuesday in June, in a hallway, over a glass of lemonade I never finished. It started as an ordinary Sunday dinner. My mother had invited the whole family, my parents, Tyler, his fiancée Brianna, my Aunt Carol, who lives 2 towns over, and me, for what she called just a little get-together, nothing special. I brought a bottle of wine and a tray of the lemon bars my mother likes. I always bring something. That's part of the role, too. Dinner went the way it always went. My father talked about his physical therapy. Tyler talked about a new truck he was thinking about, which I understood, even as he said it, was code for a truck he had already test-driven and wanted me to hear about before he asked. Brianna showed everyone pictures from a bridal boutique, holding her phone out to me twice, specifically to me, lingering a half-second longer than she did with anyone else at the table, in a way I registered but didn't examine at the time. My mother refilled glasses and steered every conversation back toward how proud she was of her kids, which mostly meant Tyler, occasionally meant me when I'd just done something useful. At one point, early in the meal, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd had a good conversation with the loan people this week, and then moved immediately on to asking Brianna about centerpiece colors, the way you'd mention the weather before changing the subject to something more interesting. I remember thinking, in the moment, that it was a strange thing to bring up and then abandon so quickly. But I didn't push on it. I have spent my whole life not pushing on things at that table, because pushing had never once, in 34 years, produced a different outcome than waiting for the actual ask to arrive on its own schedule. I finished my lemon bar. I complimented the centerpiece pictures. I had no idea, at that point, that the good conversation with the loan people was the exact conversation that would end, 5 days later, with a certified letter bearing my signature and Marisol's. Around 8, I went to use the bathroom down the hallway off the kitchen, the one my mother keeps stocked with guest soaps nobody's allowed to actually use. On my way back, I heard my name through the cracked kitchen door, and something in the tone made me stop instead of walk in. It was my mother's voice first. "She'll be fine with it. She's always fine with it." Then Tyler, laughing, a real laugh, an easy one, the kind you only have with people you trust completely. "Yeah, she doesn't even push back anymore. Remember when she used to ask questions? Now she just pays it." My Aunt Carol, softer, but still amused. "It's kind of impressive, honestly. You could ask that girl to pay your electric bill, and she'd just say, okay." And then my mother again, and this is the line that stayed lodged behind my sternum for 6 days straight. "That's Naomi. She's the pushover. Always has been. It's actually convenient, if you think about it. We just tell her it's for family, and she folds every time." Nobody said it cruelly. That was the part that undid me the most. There was no malice in their voices, no edge, nothing you could point to and call an attack. It was warm. It was fond. It was the sound of people who had found something useful and were grateful for it, the way you're grateful for a good umbrella or a reliable car. I was not a daughter in that conversation. I was not a sister. I was a mechanism they had identified, tested, and come to rely on, and they were laughing, gently, at how well it worked. I did not walk into the kitchen. I did not confront them. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not slam a door. I did not raise my voice. I stood very still in that hallway with a glass of lemonade sweating in my hand, and something in me went quiet in a way I can only describe as clinical. It was the exact same stillness I get at work when I find a discrepancy that's been hiding in a contract for years. The stillness right before you realize you're not looking at a mistake, you're looking at a pattern, and patterns are never accidents. I walked back into the dining room. I smiled. I finished the evening. I even laughed at one of Tyler's jokes about the truck, and my laugh sounded completely normal because I have spent my whole life training my face to hold steady when the numbers underneath it don't add up. I left at 9:40, hugged my mother goodbye, told her dinner was lovely, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and my mind already, quietly opening a file. That night, I didn't cry. I got out my laptop, made a fresh pot of coffee I never drank, dropped a cinnamon stick into a mug out of pure habit, and I did the thing I actually know how to do. I built a ledger. I want to walk you through what I found, because this is the part where the story stops being about hurt feelings and starts being about facts. And facts are the only language my family has ever fully respected. Document 1. 31 consecutive months of mortgage assistance payments to my parents' loan servicer, totaling just over $41,000, all initiated from my personal checking account, none of it formalized as a loan, none of it documented anywhere except my own bank statements. Document 2. The auto loan payoff for Tyler's truck 2 years earlier, $18,400, paid in a single transfer the week after he mentioned he was underwater on the loan, a transfer he had thanked me for exactly once, in a text that said, a lifesaver, with no punctuation, and never mentioned again. Document 3. My mother's credit card. A card I had been covering the minimum payment on for 2.5 years. A card whose balance had not gone down once in that entire time, because cushion, as she called it, is not a plan. It's a habit, and habits funded by someone else never have a reason to change. Document 4, and this is the one that made my hands go cold. A home equity line of credit application dated 4 months before that Sunday dinner that I found not because I went looking for it, but because my mother, without thinking, had left her email open on the shared family tablet the week before, the one she keeps on the kitchen counter for recipes and grocery lists. I wasn't snooping. I was looking up a lasagna recipe she'd sent me, and there, sitting in her inbox, unread, was a pre-approval letter from a lender for $110,000 with my parents' address on it, and a note in the body of the email from the loan officer that said, "As discussed, we'll need a cosigner given the current debt-to-income ratio. Let us know who that will be so we can begin the file." They hadn't asked me yet, but they had already started the paperwork, assuming I'd say yes. That was the moment the hallway conversation stopped being a wound and became evidence. She folds every time wasn't an observation. It was a business model, and I was about to be pre-approved into $110,000 of debt I hadn't agreed to, based on a track record they were so confident in that they didn't think they needed to ask first. I sat with that pre-approval letter open on the tablet for a long time. I didn't say anything to anyone that night. I closed the email the way I'd found it, put the tablet back exactly where it had been, and drove home with the letter photographed on my phone, saved to a folder I titled, plainly, Reference. There was a fifth document, one I didn't find until 2 nights later, and it's the one that turned my quiet, clinical stillness into something closer to resolve. I'd gone back through my own old text messages, not looking for anything in particular, just trying to build a timeline for myself, the same way I'd lay out a suspicious billing history at work, chronologically, without emotion, just dates and dollar amounts. Buried in a group text from 14 months earlier, one I'd half-registered and mentally filed away as harmless at the time, was a message from my mother to Tyler and me both, sent the week before I quietly started covering her credit card minimum. It said, "Don't worry about the visa. I've got a plan for it." 40 minutes later, in a message sent to Tyler alone, one that had synced by accident to a shared family photo backup my mother used on the kitchen tablet, was the rest of that plan. Plan is Naomi Lal. She'll pick it up in a month or two once she sees the statement. She always does. I sat with that one the longest of all 5 documents. Not because it was crueler than the others. It wasn't. It was almost identical in tone to everything else I'd found. Warm, casual, entirely untroubled. It was the timestamp that got me. 14 months. My mother had predicted, in writing, with a laughing abbreviation at the end of the sentence, exactly how long it would take me to start covering a debt she hadn't even told me existed yet, and she had been right, almost to the week. That's not a mother forgetting to ask her daughter for help. That's someone who has run the same experiment enough times to know the result before she starts it. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with knowing something devastating and having to act completely normal around the people who caused it. And if you've ever lived through it, you know it's its own quiet endurance test. I went to work those 6 days and reconciled claims files with the same precision I always had. I answered my mother's texts about paint samples for the guest bathroom with the same warmth I always used. I even helped Tyler pick out a font for the wedding invitations over a video call, sitting at my kitchen table with the pre-approval letters screenshot saved 4 folders deep on the same phone I was using to scroll through cursive fonts with him, and I never once let my voice change. People sometimes ask me how I managed that, how I sat across from my own mother and smiled while quietly building a case against the very foundation of how our family operated. And the honest answer is that competence isn't just a professional skill. It's a kind of armor, and I had spent 15 years building mine one favor at a time without realizing that's what I was doing. Stay with me here, because this is the part of the story where I want you to understand something important. I did not decide, in that moment, to punish my family. I decided to find out the full shape of what I was actually inside of. If you've ever been the responsible one, the fixer, the one whose no, nobody has ever actually had to hear, you already know that the hardest part isn't the anger. It's the audit. You have to go back through years of your own life and relabel things you thought were love as things that were, in fact, leverage. If this story feels familiar to you at all, go ahead and subscribe now, because the next part is where I stopped being angry and started being exact. The days after the hallway conversation, I didn't change anything on the surface. I answered my mother's texts the same as always. I still sent Tyler a happy birthday, love you message when his birthday came up on my calendar 3 weeks later, because it was already scheduled and I wasn't going to let a discovery change a kindness that cost me nothing. But underneath, I was building. I want to walk you through exactly what building looked like, because I think people assume competence is loud. It isn't. It's quiet and it's boring, and it's the reason it works. I requested my full transaction history from the last 3 years from my bank, itemized. I pulled every statement related to my parents' mortgage servicer and matched it against my own account, month by month, so I had an unbroken paper trail of every payment I had ever made on their behalf. I pulled the original loan documents for Tyler's truck payoff, which I still had in a folder from when I'd done it, because I keep records the way other people keep photographs. I requested a copy of the credit card agreement for my mother's Visa, the one where I was listed as an authorized user with payment access, but not as an account owner, which meant something specific and useful. I could remove myself from that payment authorization at any time, without her consent, without her signature, without a single conversation. I called the mortgage servicer directly, using the account number I already had memorized, and I asked a very specific question. I asked whether the automatic payment authorization on the account was tied to my account as a third-party payer, or whether I was listed anywhere on the loan as a cosigner or guarantor. The representative, a woman named Patrice, checked, put me on hold for 4 minutes, and came back to tell me that I was not on the loan itself. I was only the third-party payment source. My name appeared nowhere on the mortgage. I had been voluntarily feeding a debt that was never legally mine to carry for 31 months without so much as a thank you card. That single phone call changed everything, because it meant I didn't need a lawyer to stop paying. I didn't need permission. I didn't need a confrontation. I needed one login and one button. But here's the part I want you to sit with, because it's the part that made this into a story instead of just a decision. I didn't press that button the day I found out. I let it sit for 6 more days. I let the pre-approval letter sit in my reference folder. I let one more Sunday dinner pass, and I sat at that table and watched my mother pour wine and repeat, almost word for word, the same phrase she'd used a decade earlier. "We take care of our own." I smiled and said, "Of course we do." And inside, I was already 3 steps ahead of her, because now I understood exactly what that sentence had always meant, and exactly what it was about to cost her to keep saying it. The reason I waited wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. And if you've ever built a case for anything, professionally or personally, you know that the version of you that acts on the first wave of anger is never the version that wins. I wanted the 14th. I wanted the day the HELOC file was expected to close, the day the loan officer had told my mother, in an email I now had saved with a timestamp, that they needed a co-signer's information no later than the 14th to keep the file moving. I wanted my family standing right at the edge of a $110,000 decision, fully expecting me to be the name on that line, when they found out I wasn't going to be the name on anything, ever again. Let me take you 3 days out from the 14th, back to the moment I described at the very start of this story, sitting in my car outside my mother's house with my thumb over a cancel button. I want to explain what happened in between, because a lot happened in 72 hours, and every hour of it mattered. 72 hours before, on a Tuesday, I drove to my parents' house not to confront them, but to observe them, one last time, the way I might sit in on a department before I recommend it for a full audit. I brought the lemon bars again. My mother hugged me at the door, called me her rock, a word she used a lot that summer, always right before asking me for something. Over coffee, she brought up the HELOC directly for the first time, casually, the way you'd mentioned picking up milk. "So the loan officer needs your information by the 14th, she said, sliding a printed form across the table like it was a permission slip for a school trip. "It's just a formality, honey. You've done it before with the mortgage assist. This is basically the same thing, just, a little bigger." A little bigger was an understatement so large it almost made me laugh out loud. $41,000 over 31 months was one thing. $110,000 in one signature, tied to my credit for the next 15 years, was an entirely different category of trust. And she was asking for it with the same tone she used to ask me to pick up napkins on the way over. I did not say no in that kitchen. I want to be honest about that. I looked at the form. I asked a few quiet, procedural questions, the kind that sound like curiosity but are actually reconnaissance. What the interest rate was, what the draw period looked like, whether the equity being borrowed against was the full value of the house or a portion of it. My mother answered what she could and waved off the rest, saying, "The loan guy handles all that. We don't need to worry about the details." I smiled and said I'd think about it. I left with a copy of the form folded into my bag, and I drove straight to a coffee shop 2 towns over, ordered a black coffee with a cinnamon stick, and called my attorney. Her name is Denise Okafor, a family friend I'd used for a will update 2 years earlier. Sharp, unsentimental, exactly what I needed. I told her everything. The hallway conversation, the pre-approval letter, the 31 months of mortgage payments, the truck payoff, the credit card. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about almost every day since. "Naomi, you're not in a family dispute. You're in an informal, unsecured lending relationship that everyone else in your family has been treating like a birthright. It's time to treat it like what it actually is. We spent that afternoon doing exactly what I do professionally, except this time the subject was my own life. Denise drafted 3 documents. The first was a formal written notice to the mortgage servicer, revoking my authorization as a third-party payment source, effective the 14th, giving them the required notice period so there would be no confusion, no missed payment penalty attributed to any error on my part. Nothing they could later claim was sloppy or vindictive. The second was a formal letter to my mother's credit card company, removing myself as an authorized user, effective immediately, which I was legally entitled to do without her signature. The third was the one that mattered most, a written, dated statement signed by me declining in explicit terms to serve as co-signer or guarantor on any home equity line of credit associated with my parents' property, sent directly to the loan officer's office by certified mail, so there would be a federal record of exactly when I said no, and no one could later claim I hadn't been clear. That was the mechanism, not a scene, not a raised voice. A letter, a phone call, and a countdown clock that was already running whether my family knew it or not. 2 days before the 14th, I had one more discovery, and this is the one that confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the hallway conversation hadn't been a one-time lapse in judgment. It had been an accurate description of a plan. I got a text from Brianna, Tyler's fiancée, meant for their group chat with my mother, sent to me by mistake, one wrong contact selected out of a list. It said, "Do you think she'll actually sign the HELOC thing?" Tyler said once she does that, we can talk to her about the wedding venue deposit too, lol. She always says yes eventually. I read that message 4 times. Not out of disbelief. I already knew what I was dealing with by then. But out of something closer to confirmation, the same feeling I get at work when a suspicious pattern in a billing file finally resolves into a clear, undeniable shape. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the truck. It wasn't just the credit card. There was already a plan for what came after the $110,000, and that plan had a wedding venue attached to it, and it had never once, at any point, involved asking me what I wanted, or needed, or could afford, or was even willing to do. I did not respond to Brianna's text. I took a screenshot, saved it to the same reference folder, dated it, and closed my phone. Then I drove home, made coffee, I didn't finish, and waited for the 14th to arrive. If you're still with me, subscribe now, because what happened on the morning of the 14th is the part people ask me to describe twice, and I only want to say it once, clearly, the way it actually happened. The 14th fell on a Thursday. I had scheduled everything for 9 in the morning, deliberately, because I knew my mother's routine well enough to know she'd be at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, and I knew the loan officer's office opened at 9, and I knew Tyler had a habit of stopping by our parents' house most Thursday mornings before work to borrow the pressure washer from the garage, which meant, if I timed it right, more than one person would be present when the 14th stopped being a deadline and became a closed door. I want you to understand the specific texture of that morning because I've replayed it enough times to remember it almost minute by minute. I hadn't slept well, not out of doubt, but out of the particular alertness that comes before something you've planned carefully finally happens. I was up at 6. I made my coffee at home first, the same cinnamon stick out of the same jar I keep on my own counter now, a habit that had migrated from the coffee shop into my kitchen over the years without me quite noticing. I drove past my parents' street once at 8:15, slow, just to see the driveway, just to confirm Tyler's truck wasn't there yet, and then circled back to the coffee shop 3 blocks away to buy the second cup, the one that ended up cooling untouched in my cup holder, because some mornings the ritual matters more than the drinking. At 8:40, I sat in the parking lot of that coffee shop and read back through my own notes one final time, the way I'd review a file before a difficult meeting at work. Mortgage authorization, revoked, effective 9 a.m. credit card authorization, revoked, effective immediately upon processing. HELOC decline, delivered, signed, logged. Nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to walk back, nothing dependent on how the conversation in that kitchen went. That was the part that gave me the calm I needed. I wasn't walking in to convince anyone of anything. I was walking in to inform them of something that had already happened. At 8:55, I sat in my car 2 houses down, engine off, cinnamon stick coffee cooling in the cup holder, and I made 3 calls in order. The first call was to the mortgage servicer, confirming the revocation of my third-party payment authorization had processed, effective that morning, which it had. Patrice's name was on the confirmation. The second call was to the credit card company, confirming my removal as an authorized user had also processed. The third call was not a call at all. It was a certified mail tracking number I pulled up on my phone, confirming that my written decline of the HELOC cosigner request had been delivered to the loan officer's office the previous afternoon, signed for by a receptionist named Marisol. Every piece of the mechanism was in place before I ever knocked on my parents' door. That's the part I want to underline, because it's the part that separates what I did from anything petty or reactive. By 9 in the morning on the 14th, there was nothing left to argue about. The decisions had already been made, processed, and confirmed by 3 separate institutions. All that was left was for my family to find out. I knocked. My mother answered in her robe, surprised, pleased, already reaching for a second mug, because in her mind, my presence at 9 in the morning meant one thing. I was there to sign. Perfect timing, she said. I was just about to call the loan office to confirm everything on our end. I stepped inside. My father was at the table with the newspaper. Tyler's truck was already in the driveway, and I could hear the garage door going up, which meant he'd let himself in through the side, the way he always did. I sat down at the kitchen table. I did not raise my voice at any point in what follows. I want you to hear this the way it actually sounded, which was calm, almost gentle, the way you'd deliver test results, because that's essentially what it was. I told them, plainly, that I had revoked my payment authorization on the mortgage assistance, effective that morning, and that going forward, the mortgage payment would need to come entirely from their own account. I told them I had removed myself as an authorized user on my mother's credit card, and that the balance which had never once decreased in 2.5 years under my payments, was now fully and solely her responsibility. And I told them that I had, 2 days earlier, formally and in writing, declined to serve as a co-signer on the HELOC, and that the loan office had already received and logged my decline. I laid the 3 confirmations on the table as I spoke, not slapping them down, not performing anything, just setting them down the way you'd set down exhibits, one at a time, in the order I'd mentioned them. The mortgage servicer's email confirmation, the credit card company's processing notice, the certified mail receipt with Marisol's signature scanned onto it. I didn't need to raise my voice for any of it. The paper did the talking, the way paper always does when you've spent 15 years learning exactly how to make it talk. My mother's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It went from confusion to disbelief to something close to panic, all in about 4 seconds. You can't just, Naomi, we already told the loan officer you were signing. They're expecting your paperwork by end of day. I'm not signing, I said. I already told them that in writing. My father set down the newspaper. This is a family decision. We take care of our own. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I let that sentence sit in the room without absorbing it, without folding under it, without doing what I had done every single time before, which was quietly agree to be the own that got taken care of by being the one who paid. You're right, I said. And I've been taking care of you for 2.5 years without a single conversation about whether that was sustainable or fair or something I actually agreed to. That's over as of this morning. That's when Tyler walked in from the garage, pressure washer hose still in his hand, and caught the tail end of it. He didn't know yet about the letter. He didn't know about the credit card. He said, easily, the same easy tone from the hallway. What's going on? Why does everyone look like someone died? My mother turned to him, and I watched her decide, in real time, to try a different strategy, the way people do when the first approach visibly fails. She turned back to me, and her voice shifted into something softer, something wounded, something designed to reach for guilt the way you'd reach for a light switch in a familiar room. After everything this family has done for you, growing up, all the years we supported you, this is how you repay us? By pulling the rug out with no warning? I want to be honest with you about that moment, because it's the one I think about the most. There was a version of me, even 6 days out from the hallway, who might have folded right there, who might have heard after everything this family has done for you, and started running an apology through her head before her mouth even caught up. But I had already done the audit. I knew, to the dollar, exactly what had run in each direction for the last 15 years, and the ledger did not balance the way she was implying it did. It had never balanced that way. There was warning, I said. The mortgage servicer received notice 5 days ago. That's the required window, and I gave you more than that. The credit card company processed my removal this morning, which is my right as the authorized user, not something that required your consent. And the loan office received my written decline 2 days ago by certified mail, signed for by your loan officer's own receptionist. Nobody in this family was surprised except the people who assumed I'd say yes without being asked. Tyler's face changed then too, because it finally landed on him what this meant for the truck, and probably, somewhere further back in his mind, what it meant for the wedding venue conversation Brianna had texted about days earlier, the one he didn't know I'd already seen. Wait, what about he started, and stopped himself, because even he seemed to understand, mid-sentence, how it was going to sound out loud. Your truck payoff isn't affected, I said. That was a one-time payment, already made, 2 years ago. There's nothing left to revoke there. But if you were about to ask me for anything else this morning, I'd think carefully before you finish that sentence. Nobody finished any sentences after that for a while. My mother sat down heavily in the chair across from me, staring at the printed HELOC form, still sitting on the counter where she'd left it the day I visited, 3 days earlier, when I'd smiled and said I'd think about it. Here's what happened publicly, in front of witnesses, within the hour, because this is the part of the story that people always ask me to slow down on, and it deserves to be slowed down. At 9:40, the loan officer called the house line because my mother, still not fully believing what I'd told her, had called their office to clear up a misunderstanding. I sat at the table while she took the call on speaker, out of habit, because our family had never had private conversations in that kitchen, ever, and old habits don't disappear just because the ground has shifted underneath them. The loan officer, a man with a flat, professional voice, confirmed, calmly, that they had received a formal written decline from me 2 days earlier, that without a qualifying cosigner, the debt-to-income ratio on the application did not meet their lending threshold, and that the file, as of that morning, was closed, not pending. Closed, not pending. Closed. My mother asked, her voice thin, if there was any way to reopen it if I changed my mind by end of day. The loan officer said that reopening the file would require a new application and a new review period, and that given the current interest rate environment, he could not guarantee the same terms would be available even then. The kitchen went very quiet after the loan officer hung up. I remember the specific sound of my mother setting the cordless phone back into its cradle on the counter, a small plastic click that seemed unreasonably loud in that silence. Tyler had stopped fiddling with the pressure washer hose entirely and was just standing in the doorway to the garage, watching, the way you watch something you weren't supposed to see the beginning of, but can't look away from now that you're in the middle of it. Brianna wasn't there that morning, but I found out later, through Tyler, that my mother called her within the hour to warn her that the venue conversation might need to wait a little longer than expected, which told me everything I needed to know about how quickly the actual scope of the fallout was already being calculated by people who hadn't even been in the room. My father, standing by the counter, said nothing for a long moment, and then said the thing that told me, finally and completely, that this had never been about a misunderstanding at all. He said, quietly, mostly to my mother, I told you we should have gotten this locked in before she found out, not before she was asked, before she found out. As if my knowledge of the plan, not my consent to it, had been the risk they were managing. I stood up from the table. I did not yell. I did not cry. I picked up my bag, and I said the only thing I had planned to say before I left, a line I had actually written down the night before, because I wanted to get it exactly right. I've been the emergency fund in this family for 15 years, and nobody ever once asked if the emergency fund had needs of its own. I'm not angry that you needed help. I'm not even angry that you asked. I'm done being the answer to a question you never actually asked me. You just assumed. I left. My mother did not walk me to the door. That, more than anything else that morning, told me how thoroughly the ground had shifted, because in 15 years, she had never once let me leave that house without a hug at the door. Here is what happened in the weeks that followed, and I'm going to compress this the way it actually felt from the outside, because it moved faster than any of them expected and slower than the relief I felt on the inside. Within 4 days, my father called my office line, something he had never done before, ever, in 15 years of me working there. My assistant transferred the call before I could stop her, and I picked up mostly out of reflex. He didn't ask how I was. He asked whether there was a form I needed to sign to undo the misunderstanding with the loan officer. I told him, gently but plainly, that there was no misunderstanding, that the file was closed, and that no form existed that would reopen it without a fresh application and a new cosigner, one that would not be me. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Your mother's not sleeping," which I understood, even as he said it, to be less an apology and more a final attempt to see if guilt would do what paperwork already hadn't. Within 10 days, my parents' mortgage servicer sent a formal notice regarding the missed payment for that cycle, the first missed payment in the history of the loan, because the automatic third-party contribution I'd been quietly providing for 31 months had represented the difference between what they could actually afford and what the loan required. My mother called me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. I listened to them later, not out of coldness, but because I wanted to hear what she'd say when she thought I might not respond. And both messages were some version of, "We need to talk about the mortgage." Never once, "How are you?" Never once, "I'm sorry." Within 2 weeks, my mother tried a different approach entirely, one I hadn't anticipated. She reached out to Denise's office directly, not to threaten legal action. She had no grounds for that and seemed to sense it, but to ask, through Denise's paralegal, whether there was a payment plan Naomi could still agree to that wasn't as extreme. Denise called me that afternoon, half amused, half impressed, to relay the message. I told her the answer was no, and to make sure my mother understood that going through my attorney's office to negotiate a family matter was not going to produce a different outcome than going through me directly. It only confirmed, once more, how thoroughly my family had learned to treat me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be asked. Within 3 weeks, my mother's credit card, no longer being paid down by me, defaulted into a penalty interest rate after a missed payment cycle, something I only found out about because Aunt Carol, of all people, called me, not to guilt me, but out of genuine confusion, asking if I knew anything about it. I told her, honestly and without embellishment, that I had removed myself as an authorized user and that the balance and its terms were now entirely between my mother and the card company. Carol went quiet on the phone for a second and then said something I didn't expect. I always wondered how she kept that thing under control. Now I guess I know. That was the first crack of outside perspective landing anywhere in my family's orbit, and it mattered more to me than I expected it to. Within 5 weeks, the HELOC file, permanently closed, meant the roof repair my father had quietly been planning to fund with that money never happened, and a section of the back porch, already soft from water damage, partially gave way under a folding table during a cookout my mother tried to host to get everyone back on the same page. Nobody was hurt. But it was, I'll admit, a strange kind of clarity, watching secondhand, through a photo Aunt Carol texted me without any commentary at all, that the exact infrastructure my family had been quietly planning to fund on my signature was the same infrastructure now visibly failing without it. Within 7 weeks, Tyler and Brianna postponed the venue deposit conversation they'd never actually had with me, because Tyler, for the first time in his adult life, had to sit down with his own numbers, alone, without me anywhere near the spreadsheet, and figure out what a wedding actually cost when nobody upstream was quietly absorbing the difference. I heard, through my mother, in one of the voicemails I eventually did listen to in full, that the venue they'd originally wanted was no longer within reach, and they'd had to look at something smaller. She said it like it was a tragedy. I heard it as the first honest budget my brother had ever had to build in his life. I found out later, again through Carol, that the venue they eventually settled on was almost 40% cheaper than the original, and that Tyler had spent an entire weekend calling caterers himself, comparing quotes line by line, something I don't think he'd ever done for anything in his adult life before that point. Carol described it, half joking, as watching a baby deer learn to use a calculator, and I laughed when she said it, not unkindly, because I recognized something true in the image. He wasn't incompetent. He'd simply never needed the skill, the same way I'd never needed to ask permission to say no, because saying yes had always been assumed on my behalf, the same way spending freely had always been assumed on his. By the 2-month mark, my parents had listed the house. Not because the bank forced them into foreclosure. I want to be precise about that, because I never wanted my family literally homeless, and the truth is more nuanced and, I think, more honest than that. They listed it because once the mortgage assistance stopped and the missed payment notice arrived, they sat down, for what I understand was the first time in years, and did real math on what they could actually sustain without me, and the number that came back told them the house was no longer viable at their income level. They downsized to a 2-bedroom rental across town, smaller, plainer, entirely within their means. My father, in a rare moment of what I'd call honesty, told Aunt Carol, who told me that it was humbling, and that he hadn't realized how much of their lifestyle had quietly been someone else's decision for 15 years. The move itself happened over a single weekend in late summer, and I heard about most of it secondhand, through Carol, because I made a deliberate choice not to be there for the packing, not out of spite, but because I knew if I showed up with boxes and tape and my usual efficiency, I would slide right back into being the one who organized the move, labeled the boxes, and called the utility companies to switch the accounts over. Carol told me later that watching my mother sort through 15 years of a 4-bedroom house down into a 2-bedroom rental was the first time she'd ever seen my mother cry over furniture instead of over family, and she said it in a tone that suggested she found that detail as strange as I did. Tyler, for his part, went quiet for almost 6 weeks, longer than anyone else in the family. He didn't call, didn't text beyond the occasional forwarded meme that required no real engagement from either of us. When he finally did reach out, it wasn't about money at all. He asked if I wanted to get coffee, just the two of us, no agenda attached that I could find. We met at the same shop I've gone to since I was 22, and he watched me order the cinnamon stick without asking why, the way you notice a detail about someone for the first time after years of never really looking. He told me, haltingly, that going through the wedding budget alone had been the first time in his life he'd had to say the word no to Brianna about anything, and that it had been harder than he expected, and that some part of him understood, now that saying no to people you love is apparently a skill, one he'd never had to build because I'd always built it for him without either of us noticing. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because I know this part of the story can sound harsh from the outside, and I never want to pretend it didn't cost me anything. It cost me plenty. There were nights during those 2 months where I sat with my cinnamon stick coffee gone cold in front of me, scrolling through old family photos, wondering if I'd taken something too far, if there had been a gentler version of this that still landed the same lesson. But every time I ran that thought all the way through, I came back to the same place. I never once took anything from my family that was legally, morally, or financially mine to withhold in a punitive way. I withdrew things that were mine to withdraw. A payment I was never obligated to make. An authorization I was legally entitled to remove. A signature I was never required to give. The consequences that followed weren't punishment. They were math, finally allowed to run without a silent partner covering the difference. Around the 10-week mark, my mother reached out one more time, not by voicemail this time, but by a handwritten letter mailed to my condo, which surprised me because my mother had never once, in my entire life, written me a letter. It was 3 pages, and I'll be honest, most of it was still the old language, still soft appeals to family and blood and how hard things had been, but there was one paragraph near the end that was different from anything she'd ever said to me before. She wrote that she'd started to understand, watching the house sell and watching Tyler build his own budget for the first time, that she had never actually asked me what I could afford or wanted or was willing to give in 15 years. She wrote that she was sorry for the hallway conversation, which surprised me most of all because I had never told her I'd heard it. Someone, I still don't know who, Aunt Carol most likely, must have told her. I did not respond immediately. I sat with that letter for 11 days, the same way I'd sat with the pre-approval email, because some decisions deserve the same patience, whether they're financial or personal. When I did respond, I didn't respond with a phone call or a visit. I wrote a letter back, and I want to share roughly what it said, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who's trying to figure out how to rebuild something without rebuilding the exact same imbalance. I told my mother that I was open to a relationship with her and with my father and with Tyler, but that it would look different from what it had looked like before. I told her I was willing to attend one holiday gathering a season on my own schedule, not tied to any financial expectation. I told her I was willing to help in specific, discreet, agreed-upon ways in the future if asked directly and in advance, never assumed, never prearranged behind my back, and never without the option to say no without consequence. And I told her, plainly, that I would not be attending any conversation, ever again, where "we take care of our own" was used as a way to open my wallet instead of a way to describe something mutual. I told her that if she wanted to prove that phrase meant something different now, the way to prove it wasn't with an apology letter. It was with 15 years of it finally being true in both directions. She wrote back once more, shorter, agreeing to the terms, and we've since had 2 visits, both on neutral ground, both entirely pleasant, both refreshingly free of any mention of money. The first was lunch at a small cafe halfway between our 2 places, an hour and a half, no mention of the house, the loan, or the letter, just conversation about ordinary things. Her garden, a show she'd started watching, questions about my job that felt, for the first time in years, like genuine curiosity rather than a lead-in to a request. The second was a birthday dinner for my father, small, just the 4 of us, plus Brianna, no extended family, no wine bottles. I felt obligated to bring as an apology for existing. I noticed, both times, that my mother didn't reach for her phone once during dinner to show me a bill or a form or a quick question about money. It's a small thing. It shouldn't feel remarkable that a dinner with your own mother doesn't involve a financial transaction. But it did, and I let myself notice that it did, because paying attention to small, ordinary things is exactly what I'd stopped doing for 15 years while I was busy being useful. Tyler and I are still rebuilding something slower and more careful. Brianna sent me a text a few weeks ago, unprompted, that just said, "Hope you're doing okay." No request attached to it, and honestly, that small, ordinary, request-free sentence did more to earn back my trust than almost anything else that's happened since. I wrote back a simple, "I am, thank you for asking," and left it there, because I've learned that not every opening needs to be filled immediately with more than it can hold. Some relationships need to be rebuilt one small, unremarkable exchange at a time, the same way trust in a financial system gets rebuilt one clean audit at a time, not with a single grand gesture, but with a long, boring, consistent record of things finally adding up the way they're supposed to. Here's what I learned, and I want to say this directly to you, because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what it feels like to be the one everyone quietly relies on and nobody ever actually asks. Being needed and being respected are not the same thing, and it is entirely possible to spend 15 years being the first without ever once being given the second. Family loyalty that only runs in one direction isn't loyalty. It's a system, and systems only change when the person holding them together stops holding, not out of spite, but out of clarity. You do not have to yell to set a boundary. You do not have to make a scene to be taken seriously. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop doing the quiet, invisible work that was letting everyone else avoid their own numbers and let the numbers speak in your place. They are, in my experience, far more convincing than I ever was. There's something else I learned, something smaller, that I think about almost more than the big lesson, because it's the part that changed how I live day to day rather than just how I think. I learned that the cinnamon stick coffee I've ordered every morning since I was 22 isn't just a habit. It's a marker. On the morning of the hallway, I'd ordered it once. On the morning of the 14th, I ordered it once too. Calm, steady, no need for a second cup to steady my hands. In the weeks in between, when I was drafting letters and pulling statements and sitting with a $110,000 pre-approval letter open on a tablet that wasn't mine, I ordered it 3, sometimes 4 times a day. I've started paying attention to that number the way I used to pay attention to everyone else's needs, because it turns out it was the most honest ledger I had the whole time, and I just hadn't been reading it. I think about the hallway a lot, still, more than I expected to this many months out. Not with anger anymore, mostly with a strange kind of gratitude, because if I hadn't stopped at that door, if I'd walked straight past it the way I almost did, I might have signed that HELOC form without ever knowing what I now know. I might have spent the next 15 years the exact same way I spent the first 34, useful, relied upon, quietly absorbing whatever gap needed absorbing, and calling it love, because nobody had ever handed me a better word for it. Sometimes the worst moments turn out to be the ones that hand you the clearest information you've ever had about your own life, and the only real choice left is what you do with it once you have it. I also learned that competence, the very thing my family had leaned on for 15 years, was never actually the problem. Being good with numbers, being the one who reads the fine print, being the person people trust to handle things, none of that is a flaw. The flaw was in letting competence get mistaken by everyone, including me, for a standing offer. Competence should make you the person a family turns to for help. It should never make you the only name on every form nobody bothered to show you first. I am not the pushover my family laughed about in that hallway. I never was. I was simply someone who had never been given a reason to find out what would happen if I stopped. Now they know. And so do I. These days, when someone in my family reaches out with a request, even a small one, I've built myself a simple habit to make sure I never slide back into the old math without noticing. I wait 24 hours before I answer anything involving money, no matter how urgent it's framed as being, no matter how the words, "we take care of our own," get dressed up on any given day. 24 hours is enough time to ask myself the one question I never used to ask: is this something I want to give or something I've simply been trained to give? It's a small system, almost embarrassingly simple for someone who spends her professional life inside spreadsheets, far more complicated than this, but it's held for months now, and it's the reason I can say, honestly, that I'm not just living without the weight anymore. I'm living with the weight only when I choose to carry it, which turns out to be an entirely different life than the one I had before. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the fixer, the wallet, the one who always says yes eventually, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me what your version of the 14th looked like, or what it might look like if you finally let it come. Tell me, honestly, whether you'd have waited 6 days the way I did, or whether you'd have pressed that button the moment you heard the words through the door. There's no wrong answer. There's only the answer that finally lets you stop folding. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe someone who's been quietly covering a bill they were never actually asked to cover. Someone who calls it help because nobody ever taught them the other word for it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Calm Karma Stories, because there are a lot more women like me, and I think you'll want to hear what they did too. I'll see you in the next one.